1 murder and 3 robberies in 7 days. And the main suspect was the last person you'd ever consider.
Nobody recognized this young man as a potential killer. Who would have thought? Nobody thought. And that's why it's fascinating.
Police said it was all done by a medical student named Philip Markoff.
There are really 2 Philip Markoffs. The image he presented to the world was that of a successful medical student about to get married.
I mean, he had everything that you would think he would want.
How does a seemingly bright, young medical student turn from that into the monster that became known as the Craigslist Killer will be a mystery, I think, to all of us.
Now, for the first time on television, the men who tracked down the Craigslist Killer tell the whole story. One of his victims opens up about her experience. And former friends and experts in criminal behavior try to answer the question, who was the real Philip Markoff? On April 9, 2009, Tricia Leffler, a 29-year-old Las Vegas call girl, set up shop in the Tony Westin Hotel in Boston's Back Bay.
My ad said something like, "Sweet blonde, come spend some time with me, no disappointments."
To facilitate her career in the world's oldest profession, Tricia had become proficient in an exceedingly 21st century form of advertising. She posted ads on the internet service Craigslist.
Posted my ad, and within like half hour, I started getting calls.
Though she lived in Vegas, thanks to Craigslist, Tricia could ply her erotic wares anywhere in the world. And with her high-tech savvy and champagne tastes, she attracted Johns with deep pockets. Still, there were risks.
The dangers of doing something like this are pretty obvious. You can't control what happens inside the room once you let the stranger in.
It's just luck of the draw, basically. I just got the bad end of it.
Tricia's bad end came quite unexpectedly, as that night she would hook up with the most dangerous client of her life, a man who would later become known as the infamous Craigslist Killer. She had only been in town for 6 hours when he called about her ad.
Asked him what he did for a living. He said he was a student. He sounded nice over the phone. I said, "Okay, well, how long are you looking to spend with me?" And he said, "Probably the hour."
An hour would cost $200, but the man said that was okay. So thinking everything was fine, she told him where she was staying. Half an hour later, he called her from the hotel's lobby, and she told him the floor she was on. That was Tricia's standard practice with a new client, a simple security procedure. Tell them her floor, but not the room number.
I come out and meet them and just make sure that I'm comfortable with them before I let them into my bedroom.
But the man she saw that night didn't give her pause.
He was blonde, good-looking guy, just looked normal to me. Just him looking at me and giving me a smile. It actually made me feel at ease, made me feel comfortable with him.
Comfortable enough to bring him back to her room. Yet once inside, things changed quickly.
I let him walk in ahead of me. I turned around and I locked the door. And he pulled out the gun and was pointing it at me. My heart started beating really fast. He just told me to lie down on the floor and put my hands behind my back. And he took out some plastic ties. And he kneeled down and basically put one knee in between my legs and proceeded to tie me up.
At this point, Tricia was scared to death, but to her, the man appeared eerily at ease.
He's calm, like he's not shaking at all. He seems to know exactly what he wants me to do. He went through my purse, picked up my wallet, took all my credit cards and my ID out of my wallet.
Then he picked up her cell phone and tried to erase the number he had used to call her.
He actually had to take his gloves off to touch the screen. I asked him if he wanted me to do it for him, and he said, "No, I can figure it out." After he erased his number from my cell phone, cut the phone cords in the room. with the knife. It was huge. It was like a butcher knife.
Afraid of what he might do next with the blade, Tricia continued to follow his commands.
Usually I don't let anybody take advantage of me at all, but it's a whole different story when somebody has a gun and a knife and they've tied you up.
But even once he had her money, the man wouldn't leave Tricia alone.
He started looking around my room, touching things, you know. Then he goes over and stands by my suitcase. He reached down, picked up a pair of my underwear and stuck it in his pocket.
At this point, the man had been in her room for 10 minutes or more. Finally, he told Tricia to go into the bathroom.
He took out another cord from his pocket, tied it around the bathroom doorknob, and then tied me to the doorknob. And then he reached back in his pocket and pulled out a roll of duct tape. He actually took off his gloves again to put the tape over my mouth, which at this point I'm thinking, okay, now your fingerprints are on the tape.
But still, he wasn't done with her.
He left the bathroom and went back into the room where I couldn't see him. And I heard a zipper on my suitcase. Later, I figured out that he had taken another pair of my underwear.
Then the man returned and checked her ties one more time before leaving the room for good. As soon as she heard the door close, Tricia pulled her hands free.
He had me tied to the point where it was just really easy just for me to twist my wrist and get out of the ties. So at that point, I went to the neighbors and knocked on the door, and I said, I'm in the room next to you, I need to use your phone. I've just been robbed at gunpoint, I need to call security.
Tricia's decision to report the robbery was a bold and surprising move for a call girl.
I think when he left, I think he felt good about how he left me and that I wasn't going to do anything.
He chose his victims based in part on vulnerability. These were women who probably wouldn't report the crimes because they were doing, in some cases, things that were illegal. So how could they go to the police?
I thought maybe that I would get in trouble for the business that I was in Boston doing, but at the same time, at that point, I really didn't care. I just wanted him to get caught.
Tricia was willing to put herself on the line, and Boston police detectives who questioned her recognized that.
They didn't know for about 20 minutes into the conversation what I did until finally I was like, okay, look, this is what I'm doing here.
The police, to their credit, took her very seriously. They didn't just dismiss her because she was an escort.
There were clues at the scene. The robber had gotten a bit sloppy, leaving fingerprints on the zip ties and duct tape.
The problem with fingerprints are if the individual is not in one of our systems, it's not a lead that takes you anywhere at that time.
But police found something more promising. The man was caught by the hotel's security cameras.
They contacted me and asked if I would come down to the police station. And then they showed me a surveillance photo of a tall, blonde guy. And I said, that's him. He looked the same height. He was wearing the same exact thing that I had described. And the only thing different in the photo was he had a baseball cap on. I think he knew there was cameras in the hotel.
He may have known there were cameras, but he wasn't afraid of them.
He wore a baseball cap to somewhat conceal his ID, but it also said to me that he was someone that knew he wasn't in the system, that his fingerprints were not going to be something that could be traced back to him.
He certainly didn't look like a monster. He didn't act like an armed robber, or at least the stereotype that we use when we think of armed robbers. I think as a result, he wasn't that concerned about being identified on a surveillance camera.
Even though police had his image, they couldn't find a mugshot that matched, so they didn't have much to follow up on. In the following days, Tricia waited in Boston to get her cell phone back, but she didn't feel safe.
I kept moving around because he hadn't been caught.
Soon, her fear would spread through Boston. Three days after Tricia Leffler was robbed at gunpoint in her room at the Westin Hotel in Boston, Another young woman with no idea of the danger checked in just down the street at the Copley Marriott. Her name was Julissa Brisman.
She's a beautiful girl. She knew it. She knew how to use it, and probably what got her into trouble.
Photographer Mark Pines often used Julissa in his video and photo shoots.
She wanted to be a contender. She wanted to make an impression.
At the same time, Julissa was also training to be a drug and alcohol counselor. She'd overcome her own addictions in 2007.
She was turning her life around.
But the way Julissa made spending money was by offering what she called erotic massages.
Great.
That's what brought her to Boston.
She had clients in Boston, according to her friends, that she would visit, people who were her regulars.
In addition to her regulars, Julissa solicited new clients with an ad on Craigslist, just like Tricia Leffler.
I saw how she worked it. She was very cautious and had a whole screening process going on. Would never make an arrangement on the first call. She'd always call back if she thought that this person was okay.
Whatever. Goodbye.
Would always say to her, there's certain dangers that come with the territory. All you need is one nut.
Nobody denies that she put herself in a very dangerous position. And, unfortunately, it's the way that she met the so-called Craigslist killer.
Julissa had no idea the man was trouble. He made an appointment with her for 10 p.m. on Tuesday, April 14th. She let him into her room, and just as he had done with Tricia Leffler, he immediately pulled his gun and then tried to tie her hands with plastic zip ties. But Julissa didn't respond the same way.
Julissa was a tough Dominican-American woman from New York. I think she felt she wasn't going to let this guy rob her. She was going to protect her money. And so she gave him a hard time. She fought back.
I don't think that he anticipated Julissa's response because the first victim didn't respond that way. She was highly compliant. This really panicked him. He had to immediately then gain control of the situation.
A woman staying down the hall heard a high-pitched scream.
She immediately called hotel security. When security came up and they knelt down and they moved Julissa's hair away from her face, they saw blood, and the security guard freaked out. He said, "Oh my God, oh my God."
The man had beaten Julissa with his gun and shot her.
She had crushing blows to her head. Also, 3 gunshot wounds, 2 to the chest, I believe, and 1 to the abdomen. But any one of those gunshot wounds would have killed her. And they were inflicted at virtually point-blank range.
The amount of violence that he directed towards her shows that it's coming from a much deeper source. And then he left in such a panic that she was actually in the doorway. He didn't even leave her in the hotel room itself.
Mark Pines heard the news early the next morning.
My phone rang. It was Carmen, Julissa's mom. She said, Julissa died. I was the first person she called. And we just sat on the phone and we cried and moaned and sobbed.
Meanwhile, Boston police were confronted with a dreadful mystery.
Dan Duff called me while he was en route to the scene at the Marriott, and he said, Bobby, we got hit, and it looks like it might be a college student down at a Marriott hotel.
We had a lot of college students and their parents visiting, and the Boston Marathon was taking place, so there were a ton of people in the city, and here you had, in the middle of all this, a horrific murder.
The case, a beautiful young woman savagely murdered in a high-class hotel, sent a wave of fear through Boston. Police launched a nonstop push to find the man now known as the Craigslist Killer.
Behind the scenes, it's round the clock, it's 24/7. It's sleeping in the unit, sleeping in a chair, changing a shirt, grabbing a shower, living on coffee and adrenaline for days on end.
Local beat cops recognized the killer's style.
Detectives who had responded to the scene said, Lieutenant, we had one of these the other night, a couple of days ago over at the Westin Hotel, very similar.
Quickly, we were able to link the cases, both at a downtown hotel, both offering some sort of adult services, and both contacted via a Craigslist posting. We knew we had a connection between the 2 cases.
The crucial connection was the man they saw in surveillance photos from the murder. They called in Tricia Leffler to show her.
They gave me another photo, and I said, this is a really good picture of him. Where did you get it? This is, from the lobby. And they said, no, that's from another hotel. There was a girl killed at the Marriott last night, and we think this guy had something to do with it. And that's when I know that I made the right decision in calling the cops and telling them what he had done to me, because now I really wanted him to be caught.
Hoping someone else would recognize the Craigslist killer, police quickly released the surveillance photos. The man's demeanor surprised a lot of people.
The video cameras captured this man very nonchalantly walking through the hotels. He didn't have a care in the world.
He appeared to be either texting or emailing someone as he walked through the lobby. And I think if we went to the lobby of the Marriott or the Westin right now, we'd probably see 1,000 other individuals doing just that.
No one called to identify the man in the pictures. But there was another lead police hoped would take them further. Julissa had set up her appointments through a friend who quickly called to offer help.
Julissa Brisman's friend provided us with the email that our suspect, sent to her.
It seemed the killer had set up a new email address just to make the appointment.
He thought that would protect him, but he was hopelessly naive about the internet. Every time somebody hooks up their computer to the internet, they get a certain thing called an IP address. It stands for Internet Protocol. And that Internet Protocol address is really like a phone number or a fingerprint.
They could use this email address to find a location from where the emails were sent. So that was a huge clue for them.
It was turning into an unusual case for Boston authorities.
Being in an urban environment, in an inner city, the majority of our homicides are not of this type. It was completely different for us.
They had to subpoena the records of the internet provider Comcast to find out where the emails had been sent from. But the information would take days to come through, and it wouldn't come in time. The same week that Julissa Brisman was murdered, another woman in New England posted an ad on Craigslist offering erotic services, a stripper who sold private lap dances in her hotel room. She was working from a Holiday Inn Express in Warwick, Rhode Island, 50 miles from Boston, where women worried about the Craigslist killer. On the evening of April 16th, the stripper received a phone call from a young man seeking her services. Despite the glaring headlines about the ongoing manhunt for the Craigslist killer, the woman took the risk and arranged to meet the client at her hotel room a few hours later. It was a big mistake. The client, who had been playing poker at Foxwoods Casino, drove to Warwick. He stopped at a Walmart there, and police later found out he used one of Tricia Leffler's credit cards to buy a baseball cap. It was, in fact, the Craigslist killer who arrived at the Holiday Inn Express.
Our video surveillance captured him entering the lobby area, passing the desk. He heads down towards the west stairwell. We also see him at that point removing the baseball cap that he had on.
Just before 11, he knocked at room 348.
She answered the door and saw what she described to me as younger looking, early 20s, professional looking male.
He seemed harmless enough, so the stripper let him into her room. But once again, as in the Boston cases, he pulled a gun. The stripper knew right away who she was dealing with.
She screamed. The suspect at that time told her to shut up. Then he told her, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just looking for money or credit cards. He then bound her hands behind her back with plastic flex cuffs.
Then the Craigslist killer searched the room for valuables. As he lined his pockets, he asked where her laptop was, and she said she didn't have one.
He then told her, if I find a computer in the room, I'll kill you. And she said at this point she was terrified for her life.
But the woman was lucky. She was traveling with her husband, and he was waiting in the lobby for her to check in.
Because she had not contacted her husband in the lobby, her husband came up to the room, and he had the key to the room. So he opened the door,
He was confronted by this individual who was pointing a gun at him. He observed his wife on the floor, bound, behind him. He immediately stepped out of the room. He said at that point, the suspect followed him into the hall. When he heard the door shut, the husband turned around and ran down the hallway.
The robber fled in the other direction, down a stairway and out a back door. Meanwhile, the woman, who's never spoken publicly, called hotel security. She had no doubt who had attacked her.
When she responded down to the lobby, she was yelling that it's the same thing as Boston, the same thing as Boston.
There were indeed many similarities to the crimes. The man answered an ad posted on Craigslist. He pulled a gun and used zip ties to bind the woman, just as he had in the Boston cases. And once again, surveillance cameras caught him in the lobby of the Holiday Inn. Police in Rhode Island and Boston were convinced it was the same man.
The fact that he committed a very similar crime only days after the homicide of Julissa Brisman, we found just extraordinary.
To continue the same type of behavior right away is kind of like a runaway train. It's very fortunate in a way that we didn't have a double homicide here in Warwick.
The stakes were getting even higher. The Craigslist killer was clearly willing to strike again. But just when it looked like things had gone from bad to worse, Boston police caught a big break in the Julissa Brisman case. 2 days after the Rhode Island attack, investigators got the internet protocol address the Craigslist killer used to send his emails.
The IP address came back to that apartment building in Quincy and to his apartment, and that it was in the name of Philip Markoff.
Now they had a name, but they didn't know if that was the person who actually sent the emails.
Given the prevalence of wireless internet access, we couldn't be sure whether or not our suspect was using somebody else's access to the internet or their own.
The common thought was, why would he use his own computer? Perhaps somebody was just parking near this building and basically hijacking the internet signal.
So Sergeant Detective Brian Albert and the Boston Police fugitive team settled in outside this apartment building in the bedroom community of Quincy. They were watching for the man in those surveillance photos.
They were looking for a tall, over 6 feet, white guy with blonde hair. And lo and behold, he eventually came out of the front door.
Actually, at one point, he went over and tinkered with a car to try to do some repairs on it. I got out of my soft car and walked over to take a closer look to see if it was really him. And I walked by him within a few feet, and I was pretty positive that that was the person, at least that I had seen in the videos from the crimes.
He called in to headquarters.
I contacted Lieutenant Detective Robert Murner immediately, and I told him that I liked him to be the guy that was in the surveillance videos.
We felt we were getting closer to Mr. Markoff.
At the same time, police began looking into just who Philip Markoff was. What they found was a shock.
We knew that he was a student at Boston University Medical School, and again, did not fit the profile, if you will, of someone that we would expect of doing armed robbery, murder.
On paper, this isn't, who it should have been.
Markoff was a 23-year-old training to be a physician, learning to save lives at the very same hospital where Julissa Brisman was pronounced dead.
In Boston, most of our homicides are committed by a certain segment of the population. It's not usually a medical student who has everything before him. Immediately, it becomes even more frightening because he's not motivated by money or some sort of gang beef. He's motivated by something, I guess, far more sinister.
Cheryl is a very quiet, close-knit community.
3 churches, 1 grocery store, only like 2 places, 3 places to go get food at. I mean, everyone just knows everyone.
Cheryl, New York is the hometown of Philip Markoff, accused in 2009 as the Craigslist killer. He lived there with his mother and stepfather.
He was one of those guys, the growth spurts. So he was like unmistakable, blonde hair and taller than everybody, skinnier. He stood out.
He was always awkward, because he was so much taller than everybody else. Almost like he hadn't grown into his body yet.
He liked bowling and playing penny poker with friends. But most of all, Philip stood out in school.
He was such a good student. All the teachers liked him, even teachers that didn't have him in their classes.
He was an excellent student, an honors student. He was very cooperative, very friendly, polite, gentlemanly. You know, he would come into class and stop and talk to me about his bowling or his golf.
He graduated in 2004 and enrolled at the State University of New York in Albany.
He was well-dressed, clean-cut, short hair. As a friend, he was a lot of fun.
He was pre-med, which meant plenty of studying.
He spent a lot of his time in his room doing his schoolwork.
He was hardworking. He did really well in all of his classes, and he was a smart guy, but socially awkward.
When he had time, he joined in the dorm poker games.
There would always be maybe 2 or 3 poker games going on, sometimes till the late hours of the morning. And Phil wasn't always involved, but he seemed to be there quite regularly, and when he was, he would be there all night.
That seemed a lot more important to him than women. Even when he went out, Philip didn't pay much attention to them.
Never really seemed like he cared so much to go out of his way to, make rapport with these women.
Markoff seemed to have trouble relating to women, and there were signs that were more ominous. After a night out drinking in his sophomore year, he was walking his friend Morgan Houston back to her dorm when suddenly he was groping her.
He had pushed me up against the wall, and he was trying to kiss me. And I was trying to push him off of me. I was turning my head to the side and saying, "Get away from me, Phil." And he was, forceful.
Another friend pulled him off. Morgan never confronted Philip about it, but she couldn't forget.
It was scary to look back on that night that he pushed me up against the wall. It was...
Still, they remained friends and sat next to each other at graduation in 2007. Philip had finished his pre-med work in only 3 years.
We were finally going somewhere with our lives, and he was so excited to be going to Boston.
Philip had been accepted at the prestigious Boston University School of Medicine. And he had something else to celebrate. He was now dating a lovely young woman named McAllister.
She's really introverted and quiet. I don't think she had a mean bone in her body. She was just a really sweet girl.
Megan was another pre-med who grew up in Little Silver, New Jersey. She and Philip met when they both volunteered at a hospital in Albany.
She didn't have a lot of boyfriends before Markoff. He must have seemed like the real deal to her. God, he was going to medical school, he was tall, he was good looking. It's what every woman would want in a husband. And she, I think, worshipped him.
Megan moved to Boston with Philip, and they got engaged. Their wedding was set for August 14th, 2009 at a seaside restaurant in New Jersey.
Megan made a wedding website, and she was always updating it, and everyone was telling her congratulations on Facebook, and she just seemed really, really happy and really, really excited.
Megan was at home with her parents during the week when police believed Markoff had transformed into the Craigslist Killer. But she returned to Boston on April 18th, and police saw her with Philip as they watched his apartment building.
She appeared to be in a good mood. She was jovial, talking, smiling. He appeared to be a little bit distant, kind of quiet.
The police kept watching Markoff, trying to come up with more evidence against him. They even followed him into a store to try to lift fingerprints they could match to the crime scenes.
We had him under 24-hour surveillance, so we were not worried that he was going to commit a crime again, or if he did, we certainly would be able to stop it.
Even though the fugitive unit believed Markoff was the right suspect, they needed an ID from someone who had seen him commit a crime.
We did have a live victim from the Westin Hotel, which was Tricia Leffler. We did have a live victim and her husband from the Warwick, Rhode Island incident.
But the investigators' luck was beginning to run out. Both victims had left New England, and while the cops were trying to track them down, Markoff suddenly seemed about to do the same thing.
Mr. Markoff came out on Monday, put a suitcase in the car with his fiancée, and proceeded to get on 95.
Philip Markoff was driving south toward Rhode Island, Cops knew that if he left the state, they might lose him for good. So Sergeant Detective Albert followed him, staying a discreet distance behind.
I was in constant phone contact with members of the command staff up at headquarters. I was giving them pretty much a minute-by-minute briefing on where the vehicle was, how it was traveling, and where we thought maybe it was going. It began to get hectic right around this point, as far as what we were going to do and when we were going to do it.
We decided we did not want him out of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, so the decision was made to stop the vehicle.
Albert pulled the couple over and said he was seizing the car. Markoff didn't seem surprised.
He had nothing to say, didn't want to know why the car was being taken, and he was acting very unusual considering the circumstances.
Philip refused to speak without a lawyer, but Megan had a lot of questions for police.
I don't believe she had any idea of the activities that Philip was into in the weeks that she was away in New Jersey. I put a surveillance photo of the individual that we had at the Marriott Hotel, and she said to me, "Oh, that's Philip. Where did you get this picture from?"
It was a damning identification. And then more news came in from New York City, where a detective had caught up with Tricia.
He gave me a pile of, I believe it was 7 different photos. I started going through them one by one. When I got to number 5, I started shaking, and I said, "This is him."
On April 20th, police arrested Philip Markoff for the murder of Julissa Brisman and the robbery of Tricia Leffler.
It felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulder. Of course, it's not gonna bring back Julissa, and I wish that she could possibly be here telling you her story also, but I'm glad that my story and my positive identification put him where he was, behind bars.
This was Cheryl, New York, and I knew this boy. I just couldn't believe it. There's got to be some mistake.
People who knew him were stunned when Philip Markoff was arrested as the Craigslist Killer.
When you look at Markoff's background, there really were no major red flags at all.
How many times have we done stories about murderers and the neighbors say, "Boy, he was the nicest guy imaginable, so quiet." It's really a cliche at this point, and Philip Markoff met that cliche to the hilt.
The person who seemed most surprised was his fiancée.
When Philip Markoff was arrested and his name was released to the public, McAllister immediately rushed to his defense. She sent out emails to a couple of news organizations saying he would never do this, he wouldn't even hurt a fly. It was a very passionate, very angry reaction to what was happening, and who can blame her? She was supposed to be marrying this man in just a couple of months.
Many people wondered how it was possible she didn't know what was going on.
Megan McAllister is another of Philip Markoff's victims in this whole story.
The truth is that he was a very clever guy. He was shrewd, he was manipulative. Not only did his fiancée believe every word he said, but so did his classmates, his family members, and his neighbors and his friends. Nobody thought he was an armed robber. Nobody thought he would kill anyone.
But authorities in Boston said they had plenty of evidence against Markoff. His fingerprints matched those found at the robberies of Tricia Leffler and the stripper in Rhode Island. And there was a crucial connection to the murder of Julissa Brisman as well. When police searched Markoff's apartment, they found a 9mm handgun, just like the one used in that crime.
The shell casings that were left behind at the Marriott Hotel were linked ballistically to that weapon and one of the bullets that was taken out of her body.
Markoff had kept the gun in a hollowed-out copy of Gray's Anatomy, a medical textbook. Police traced the purchase of the weapon to Markoff through a fake ID they had uncovered in his wallet. His apartment yielded much more.
We found similar electrical ties, which were duct taped to the rear of a clothes dryer. We found ammunition that was duct taped to the rear of a clothes dryer.
And remember the underwear that the robber took from Tricia Leffler's suitcase?
They found those 2 pair of underwear, balled up in a pair of his socks and then stuffed in the box spring of his mattress. That linked him to the Leffler robbery.
Authorities believed he had taken them as a kind of trophy.
It made no sense otherwise, other than, you know, maybe some type of sexual gratification or a trophy, a souvenir of some sort.
It's kind of like a baseball player who hits a home run and wants to keep the ball. Well, he wanted to keep these trophies in order to relive the good times that he had had with his victims.
With the evidence from his apartment in hand, authorities arraigned Philip Markoff in June 2009 for murder, kidnapping, and armed robbery.
How do you plead to this indictment, sir? Not guilty.
His parents were in court, but his fiancée, McAllister, was not.
She went to the jail where he was being held without bail and essentially ended the engagement. The evidence, it seems, became overwhelming for her.
And the police kept uncovering more evidence as they delved deeper into Philip Markoff's background. They found that he spent hours on the internet, trawling the kinkiest of websites, far kinkier than the adult services listings on Craigslist.
He had set up on alternative lifestyle websites. These websites cater to people who like bondage, S&M, transvestite sex, transgender sex.
Authorities said it was just one more sign of Markoff's secret life.
Bound her arms with plastic ties.
They believed they would have no trouble convicting him.
All of this was really a mountain of evidence that pointed in only one direction, and unequivocally that Philip Markoff was the Craigslist killer.
He would have been convicted of first-degree murder. There was an overwhelming amount of evidence that he planned these crimes, that he premeditated them, and he would have been sentenced in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to life without parole.
As the trial date neared, Tricia Leffler prepared as well. She had left Las Vegas and the life she was leading there.
I'm living in Ogden, Utah. I am going to school to be a pharmacy tech. After everything, I just wanted to be around family and friends that knew me and knew my situation.
She was getting ready to face Philip Markoff once again.
I was nervous, but at the same time, a part of me wanted to confront him and show him that, you know, you didn't get the best of me. I helped put you away, and I'm glad I did it.
Those closest to Julissa Brisman also prepared for the trial.
Julissa's family was anxious for the opportunity to witness a public trial against Philip Markoff.
I wanted to see him. I wanted to lock eyes with him.
But before the trial could begin, Markoff would deny Julissa's family and friends any legal satisfaction.
He had a homemade scalpel that he fashioned from a razor and a ballpoint pen. I mean, he had thought all of this out.
Philip Markoff committed suicide on August 15th, 2010. It would have been right around his first wedding anniversary.
I think he thought to himself, what could have been? Instead of sitting here in jail, accused of murder, facing the rest of my life behind bars, I could have been married to this beautiful woman in a nice ceremony and had a nice life and still been in medical school.
He knew what his future was going to be, and I just don't think he wanted to deal with the disgrace, the humiliation, as well as the torment of his own inner life.
So just who was the Craigslist killer?
Why did a person who seemed to have everything throw it all away?
Philip Markoff may have taken that answer to his grave, but his death hasn't stopped investigators from speculating about his real motives. Many believe his interest in kinky sex sites and his many trips to casinos indicated he was rapidly devolving into a pathological thrill seeker.
That was one theory that was put out there, that this was about an adrenaline rush, and controlling and scaring people is something that gave this person an adrenaline rush in the same way that gambling would.
It would appear that Mr. Markoff got some excitement or at least some adrenaline rush from continuing into these crimes.
Not everybody in Boston law enforcement subscribes to that theory, however. For the district attorney's office, Markoff's crimes could be explained more simply.
It appears that robbery was the motive.
Yet forensic psychologist Louis Schlesinger believes Markoff was really acting out an urgent sexual fantasy.
The tendency for many members of law enforcement is to present a logical motive. He committed an armed robbery, and the sexual behavior that occurred was an afterthought. The opposite is actually correct. The sexual behavior is the primary motivation, and the stealing is usually secondary. He was there to act out a very stimulating sexual fantasy involving bondage and sadomasochism and fetishism and control and domination. This starts 10, 20, 25 years earlier in the individual's mind, in their fantasy life.
According to Schlesinger, most people who have these fantasies do not act on them. But it seems Philip Markoff couldn't stop himself.
It just wasn't enough for Markoff to fantasize about this. This aspect of his personality was so consuming that he destroyed his entire life as a result of it.
Destroyed his own life and the lives of so many around him.